Hello, this is Dr. Grande. Today's question is, can I analyze the case of DeOrr Kunz Jr.? Just a reminder, I'm not diagnosing anybody in this video, only speculating about what could be happening in a situation like this. If you enjoy this video, please like it, subscribe to my channel, consider supporting me on Patreon, and check out my podcast, Bella Grande Media. I will put the relevant links to those items in the description for this video. So first I'll look at the background in this case, then I'll move to my analysis. This case starts on July 9, 2015, when a group of 5 people from Idaho Falls traveled about 2 hours to the Timber Creek campground. This is about 10 miles from DeOrr, Idaho. They were going on a camping and fishing trip. They arrived at the campsite at about 9:30 p.m. Here are the 5 people who were on the trip: 2-year-old DeOrr Kunz Jr., his 26-year-old mother, Jessica Mitchell, his 26-year-old father, and Jessica's fiancé, Vernal Kunz, Jessica's grandfather, 76-year-old Robert Walton, and a 35-year-old friend of Robert Walton's named Isaac Reinwand. According to family members, the decision to take this trip, which was made by Jessica and Vernal, was unexpected. Here's the story we hear from the family members at the campsite about what happened. When the family arrived at the campsite, they set up 2 separate tents. The next morning, July 10, 2015, Jessica and Vernal claimed they went to a nearby store to buy feminine products for Jessica. DeOrr was with them on this journey, although nobody from the store remembers seeing him. They returned to the campsite at about 1 p.m. The stories get fragmented from this point on. There are a lot of different stories that came out. Jessica and Vernal wanted to look around the area and potentially go down to a nearby creek. Jessica, Vernal, and Isaac started walking to the creek. Isaac would say that he and Jessica were together and Vernal and DeOrr were behind him. So he was saying that all 4 were walking down to the creek, so everybody except Robert Walton, whereas Jessica and Vernal tried to make it seem as though they were walking down with just Isaac. Jessica yelled to Robert that he needed to keep an eye on DeOrr. So again, in her version, DeOrr is with Robert. He was not walking down to the creek. Initially, as they were walking away from the campsite, DeOrr started following them. Jessica and Vernal asked him if he wanted to come along with them or stay with Robert. DeOrr started walking back toward Robert. Robert said he never heard Jessica yelling to him and did not know he was responsible for the child. Jessica and Vernal had only made it 150 feet away from the campsite. When they saw some fish, they thought DeOrr would be interested in seeing. They walked back to the campsite to get him. Jessica said they were gone only about 5 minutes. Vernal would say it was about 15 to 20 minutes. So again, we see a lot of fragmentation, several different stories. Was DeOrr with Robert the whole time? Did DeOrr walk toward his parents, then get sent back to Robert? There are a lot of issues here that are unclear. It's hard to get a good picture of the actual logistics of the movements of the people. Jessica and Vernal would say when they returned to the campsite, Vernal did not see DeOrr. He asked Robert where he was. Robert said, "I thought he was with you." Isaac returned to the campsite later, so he was not there when the alleged disappearance occurred. At 2:28 p.m., Jessica called 911. It's been reported that Vernal made his way back to his pickup truck and drove away from the campsite. He was trying to find cell service so he could call 911 as well. His call actually went through at 2:22 p.m., 6 minutes before Jessica's call. He told the dispatchers that DeOrr was missing for about an hour. Jessica told the operator that her 2-year-old son was missing for about an hour, so their stories would match at this point, although later we see some changes. Jessica said that DeOrr was wearing cowboy boots, blue pajama pants, and a camouflage jacket. A massive search effort was launched. There was a particular interest in the creek, which was only about 45 feet away from the campsite. No sign of DeOrr was ever found. The police are positive that he was not in the creek. On July 13, Jessica and Vernal said that they believed DeOrr was kidnapped. They stayed at the campsite for several days as the search continued. In January of 2016, Jessica and Vernal were named as suspects in the case. A local sheriff indicated the parents were hiding something and suggested that the only other option, based on their stories, was homicide. So here we see a not-so-subtle accusation. The family hired a private investigator who was a friend of the family. His name was Frank Vilt. Frank quit the investigation due to what he claimed were circumstances beyond his control, including a breach of trust on the part of Jessica and Vernal about taking the case to a national level, and he did not feel as though the couple was being truthful. The family hired another private investigation company that was owned by a man named Philip Klein. Philip and his investigators found evidence that seemed to point away from the idea that DeOrr was kidnapped or attacked by an animal. Jessica and Vernal fired Philip after he stated his opinion. It appears as though another family member might have hired him back for a while, but then he quit the investigation altogether. Eventually, Jessica and Vernal filed a lawsuit against Philip Klein for libel, slander, fraud, breach of contract, and infliction of emotional distress. The couple would be defeated on 3 separate occasions in court. The judge would say there was no wrongdoing on the part of Philip Klein. Jessica and Vernal were evicted from their apartment because they failed to pay rent. This was not long after the disappearance, when Philip Klein was still working on the case. Philip was given access to the apartment by the landlord. He claimed that he discovered the missing camouflage jacket, as well as several toys that the parents said were with DeOrr when he disappeared. Jessica and Vernal broke off their engagement not long after DeOrr's disappearance. Jessica married somebody else just 8 months after the disappearance and moved away from the area. Vernal moved out of the state and married somebody else as well. Robert Walton died of cancer in June of 2019. The last update in this case at the time of making this video indicated that another private investigator was working on the case. As far as I know, the police still believe the parents were involved in the disappearance. No arrests have been made in this case. Now moving to my analysis. Before I look at the theories in this case, there are a few items that may shed light on the various theories. In 2017, a cadaver dog signaled at 5 locations in the area of the campsite. One was about 3/4 of a mile from the campsite. There is no way to know if these are connected to DeOrr. The dogs didn't specify the name of the person associated with the scent. In 2019, a cadaver dog gave a hard alert for a body. So I guess the dog was really sure that a body had been in that area. Jessica Mitchell had 2 older children who did not go on the trip with her, but the primary custodian was Jessica's ex-husband. Jessica suggested this custody arrangement was just to provide financially for the children and has nothing to do with her not wanting them. Robert Walton, who as I mentioned died in 2019, was not in good health at the time of the disappearance. He was on oxygen and appeared to have some cognitive limitations. Isaac may have had diminished mental capacity and some type of criminal record. We see different reports about his criminal record. The most credible reports seem to indicate he may have had some minor infractions in the past, nothing serious. Philip Klein has made many accusations against the couple, including the one I mentioned about finding the camouflage jacket and toys. Here are some other accusations he made. He said that Jessica said she knew where DeOrr's body was, but stopped short of revealing the location. There was blood found on Vernal's truck, and both Jessica and Vernal failed so-called lie detector tests several times. As I've talked about many times before, polygraphs are nonsense. Somebody cannot fail or pass a polygraph. This is just a tool that the police use to trick suspects. It's not really clear why the police would share information about so-called failing or passing to Philip Klein. So if Jessica and Vernal did fail or pass, I don't see how Philip Klein would have known. I'm skeptical about the claims of Philip Klein. It would appear to me that if those claims were true, the police would have made an arrest in this case, especially the claim about Jessica saying she knew where the body was. Let's look at the various theories in this case. Theory number 1. DeOrr wandered away from the campsite on his own. He made it far away from the campsite, even though he was only 2 years old and wearing oversized cowboy boots. He managed to evade hundreds of people who were searching for him. He ended up somewhere like down in a ravine or in a body of water where no one found him, or perhaps an animal devoured him. This theory is extremely unlikely and has been effectively ruled out by the police. The search of the area was extensive and started not long after DeOrr was reported missing. If he had walked off, it's extremely likely that his body would have been found. This takes me to theory number 2. DeOrr was at the campsite when a bear, cougar, or some other wild animal attacked him and carried him away. The animal was careful not to knock off the cowboy boots or leave any other trace of the attack, like no blood, no clothing, nothing. This theory is also unlikely, and the police do not think it happened. The extensive search also applies to this theory, although an animal, of course, could have carried DeOrr farther than he could have walked. This would be unusual, but technically possible. Now moving to theory number 3. An unknown assailant somehow knew DeOrr was there at the campsite and that he would be left unattended at some point. They managed to sneak up on the campsite, grab him, and disappear undetected. They did this despite the fact that the campsite was in the middle of nowhere, and the time window during which they could have taken DeOrr was only a few minutes. Again, according to the story, 5 minutes to 15 to 20 minutes. Theory number 4. When the family was at the campsite either on July 9 or July 10, DeOrr was somehow killed by accident or intentionally. In order to cover up whatever happened, the couple made up this whole story. They may have disposed of the body somewhere between the campsite and the store that they went to on July 10, or Vernal could have disposed of the body on his trip to call 911. There's also this version of the theory where DeOrr was never at the campsite in the first place, like the accident or the homicide occurred somewhere else, perhaps in Idaho Falls, and the couple took this trip and created this whole story to cover up that fact. This version of the theory is supported by the fact that no one saw DeOrr other than the 4 people who were with him, but of course is contradicted by Isaac's statement. He was sure that DeOrr was there on both days. Let's take a look at the evidence both for and against this theory. Starting with the evidence that tends to support this theory. Jessica and Vernal changed their stories several times. For example, they would initially say that they contacted the police an hour after DeOrr disappeared, then they changed it to 20 minutes. The police said it was actually about an hour. Robert changed his story as well, although not as many times as Jessica and Vernal. Isaac's story remained constant, but not entirely helpful, as he said he wasn't at the campsite when DeOrr disappeared. In Isaac's version of the story, he and Jessica went down to the creek together. Vernal and DeOrr were following them, but never showed up at the creek. This changes the circumstances of DeOrr's disappearance, like the last person he was with was Vernal, and no one else was with them. The parents managed to lose the support of 2 private investigators. Even though I'm not too sure about the credibility of Philip Klein, the first investigator, Frank Vilt, was very experienced and credible. I think the fact that Frank turned on the parents is telling. Furthermore, the police clearly believe that the parents were involved. During an interview with the media, Jessica said that she believed Vernal could have been capable of harming DeOrr. Why did Vernal drive away in his truck to call 911? He said he wanted more than one bar on his phone. He didn't want the call to get disconnected in the middle. This seems very unusual given the circumstances. One would think he would just take his chances with the one bar, that he would make the call and hope for the best. At least people would probably be on the way if the call wasn't disconnected too early. Clearly, the service was sufficient so that Jessica could make the call. The general circumstances around taking the trip in the first place seem unusual. The trip was a surprise. The couple was unprepared. Even though they were towing a camper, they had to make an unplanned trip to a store. They decided to take Jessica's 76-year-old grandfather, who was ill and on oxygen, and they took a friend of Robert's, who it appears as though Robert barely knew, based on an interview that Robert would give later on. Robert indicated he didn't trust Isaac. If the parents were struggling financially to the degree that they lost their apartment shortly after the disappearance, why did they take a trip that had costs associated with it? Perhaps they considered DeOrr part of their financial problem. As far as emotional factors, I don't read too much into people not acting the right way after a crisis, but I'm surprised that the parents moved on so quickly with their lives. Jessica was married just 8 months after the disappearance. She implied that she wasn't looking for love. It just happened and she couldn't turn it away. People can find love at any time, but usually if somebody's grieving the loss of a child, they're not going to be in a frame of mind where they would even think about romance. Alternate theories of the disappearance support this theory, the cover-up theory. DeOrr walking off by himself, the wild animal, and the abduction theory are all extremely unlikely. Now looking at the evidence that contradicts this theory. What was the motive of the parents if they were involved? I mentioned possible financial concerns, but that's usually not a powerful motive for murdering a child. If it was murder, why would they bring along additional witnesses? Why didn't the parents simply take DeOrr and no one else? If it was an accident, why not just tell the truth? That would have been a lot easier and more straightforward than making up this whole story. The 4 adults appear to be unlikely conspirators. Why would Robert and Isaac agree to conspire? What's in it for them? Jessica and Vernal did not appear to be particularly organized. If disorganization was helium, the parents would have been floating. Critical thinking skills did not seem to be their specialty either. I'm not sure they were capable of a cover-up or murder. The law enforcement officers involved in this case appear to be highly skilled. It's amazing to me that Jessica and Vernal could defeat their efforts to find the truth. In looking at the 4 theories, how would I rank them from the most probable to the least probable? This is just my opinion. Again, no one in this case has been charged with any crime. I would say that theory number 4 is the most likely, so accident or homicide. Probably at or near the campsite, meaning DeOrr was actually there on the trip. Again, there's this theory that maybe they didn't take him along at all. In my opinion, the most likely time for the disposal of the body would have been the mysterious trip to the store on July 10. This fits in with what Isaac was saying. He was with Jessica walking to the creek, and Vernal and DeOrr were behind them right before the disappearance. Maybe Isaac assumed DeOrr was with Vernal, like Vernal was pretending that DeOrr was with him. Vernal was talking as if DeOrr was there, like saying things to him. This theory, of course, means that Robert Walton was in on it, or the parents convinced him that their version of events was true. The strongest evidence for me in support of this theory is the frequently changing stories, the 2 private investigators both suggesting the couple was lying, the police essentially saying this was a homicide, the mysterious drive away from the campsite to call 911, and the low probability of the alternate theories. This brings me to the next theory in the list. Here I would say theory number 3, the abduction theory. This is possible. Somebody would have really had to plan this out carefully, like be watching this family. I don't know how they could have done that without being spotted, but there was a lot of trees in the area, so they could have been hiding. Again, it's possible, so I would put it as the second most probable theory. I would then move to theory number 2, a bear or cougar, and then finally theory number 1, the boy walked away on his own. Moving to my final thoughts, if the parents were not involved in the disappearance, then they have lost twice. They lost their son, and now they have this dark cloud of suspicion hanging over their heads. If they were responsible, it appears as though they got away with it. Unless new evidence is discovered, like human remains, it seems unlikely that anything will ever happen to the parents. The risk, however, will always be there. The sword of Damocles is hanging over their heads. Whether they are guilty or not, they have to live with the constant threat of facing justice. Those are my thoughts in the case of DeOrr Kunz Jr. Please put any opinions and thoughts in the comment section. They always generate an interesting dialogue. As always, I hope you found my analysis of this topic to be interesting. Thanks for watching.